I'm Akash Srinivas, a freelance journalist with a Freethinker, and today I'm joined by the widely acclaimed activist, author, and dissident Sahar Delijani. Sahar is a author who wrote the 2013 novel The Children of the Jacaranda Tree. I think it was translated to 32 languages and published in 75 countries. And you've got a new one coming out, I think, in 2027, For Every Person You Kill by Melville House. Sahar was born in the notorious Evin Prison in Tehran and was the child of revolutionaries, secular leftist revolutionaries in the revolution in 79, whose parents were arbitrarily detained as political prisoners in the aftermath of the so-called Islamic revolution. Since then, Sahar has grown up in Iran and left for Italy and the US and has since been a lifelong activist. How have you been, Sahar?
I'm okay, worried. I've been worried for a long time, but we're trying to just sort of like get back to life as well and try to live a little bit too.
Before we do like a kind of historical overview of the politics of the internal struggle in Iran, just give the audience a brief update on the situation on the ground. But for those who haven't been paying attention over the course of the last 2.5, 3 months, the US and the Trump administration and Israel started a imperialist invasion of Iran. They've bombed many civilian areas, hospitals, infrastructures, especially almost disgracefully the school in southern Iran in Minad, killing I think 170 children. Since then, there's been non-stop retaliation by the regime to neighboring Gulf Sunni states as well as I think all the way as far as Jordan as well. And it's been more or less stopped now since the ceasefire, but how do you analyze where we are with that situation as well as the suffering of the people on the ground?
Well, it's hard to tell what's going to happen if the ceasefire is going to hold, as we've just seen the past few days, with the tensions escalating again. So it's really hard. I think like this, like everyone's is this state of limbo. Everyone is just waiting, which is unfortunately how we've been feeling for a long time. It's as if, we have no control over the event. So we're just like sort of waiting for the next action or the next, how things are going to develop. But especially now, so we're hoping that the ceasefire will hold, that it will turn into something more meaningful as far as end of war and bombing, and not just for Iran, of course, for Lebanon, for Palestine, and for the region, because the region is on the brink of an all-out war. That's the first thing, and so that's where we're watching, but at the same time, inside Iran, as you know, people have been disconnected for months now. From there's been a digital shutdown, and in this darkness, the regime has started again the executions of political prisoners, of protesters, sham trials behind closed doors, no evidence, no independent lawyer. Um, they're doing it very quickly. They're passing these death sentences for anything from these they have these charges like waging war against God, corruption on earth, and then there are all these charges that are like, oh, for throwing stones or for blocking the road, or like things like that, and for all of them. And then like higher ones like cooperation with enemy, espionage, and so on. But for all of them, they're passing these death sentences. And again, no one even knows, because these are a lot of them are being also taken from these forced confessions that they tortured and beat the prisoners, and then they come parade them on state television. Some have still bruises on their faces, confessing to their crimes. So it's a very, very frightening, very, very worrying, because also the regime has had this long history of executions, of using it as a weapon to oppress and to repress, and we've seen it in the greatest sort of the biggest massacre of political prisoners in 1988. So, I would say right now, everything you look at is pretty dark, is pretty concerning. Um, and yeah, so I mean, we're hoping to put pressure at least for the regime to stop executing. They don't need to execute. There's just no reason. They only want to spread fear into people to just tell them warning, just don't even think about speaking, don't even think about coming out, don't even think about opposing. So yeah, that's sort of how things are for the moment.
In terms of the basic history of Iran, not many people fully understand it, and most of the time when you hear about the history, it's a kind of like, I guess, partial or like, I guess, biased overlook. So I just wanted to start off, let's say, with the Pahlavi regime. For those who don't know, just before the Pahlavi regime came to power, there was a kind of a different monarchy. There was the Qajar dynasty. They ruled from like the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century, and in the beginning of the 20th century, in 1905, there was a constitutional revolution. It was when the parliament, the Majlis, was established, and when there was like a limited constitution that checked the powers of the Shah. And that mini revolution had a kind of civil war that went on to like 1911. And then in 1921, you had the coup, which was done by Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first one. He was supported by the British Empire, I think, at that point, and from that point on, that was the beginning of the Pahlavi dynasty. Apart from like a 5 year interlude in like the Second World War when the Soviets and the British occupied and invaded, basically from 21 all the way to 79, the Pahlavi dynasty has been continuing nonstop. And most people, there's a lot of discussion about the legacy of the regime in, I think, diaspora circles about the Islamic Republic versus the Pahlavi regime. And not many people understand the nature of the monarchy. So just for those who don't know, kind of try and explain that.
Yes, this was a good description that you gave, but yes, the second part of the Pahlavi monarchy under Muhammad Reza Shah was which then eventually led to the 79 revolution, was very much a full-on, full-force dictatorship of its own. It would, the Evin prison that is so notorious now, it was built under his regime, as sort of as detention center for political prisoners run by the Savak, which was the secret police, sort of organized and established with America and the help of Mossad at the time. And it was a monarchy, and it had a king. It just wanted a power under this monarch, under this king. Of course, people were ever since that the coup of 53, things changed as far as the power of the parliament was concerned. And it had this idea of, they talk about it so much now that the people, sympathizers of the monarchist regime, that it was modernizing Iran. What I think is always missing in that narrative is that there's this sense of modernizing, as if modernizing is only, building roads, or I don't know, building hospitals, which is, of course, fundamental, very important, building schools and hospitals and so on. But what was also important was education, right? Was culture, was freedom of expression, and was freedom of movement, political expression, and so on, which none of that was any concern for the Pahlavi and that dynasty, and especially this sort of the restructuring of the economic system that would work better for the working class. That was also non-existent. A lot of people were in poverty. A lot of people were illiterate. So there was this sort of like the facade of modernization, but deep down in the society, things were not moving at all, especially for, marginalized people. Which then eventually led to the 1979 revolution, which was, as I always say, sort of hijacked by the Islamic move, one of the Islamic move, because there were many more religious movements, but the one that was led by Khomeini. And but at the time before it, there were so many, leftist, communist, socialist, Marxist groups, other Marxist, Islamist groups. So there were many, and but what happened was that a lot of leftist groups were very much repressed under the Shah, whereas they sort of left the more religious parties to organize and to talk and to carry forward their opposition, because anyway, like the Muhammad Reza Shah was also religious and felt aligned. So then by the time the 1979 revolution happened, the leftist movements had become quite weakened. And so everything that happened after the revolution, and then the with Khomeini coming back to Iran, and then like established the Islamic Republic as then later we know it as.
Just to backtrack for a second, when people think about, for example, 1953, a lot of people forget that there was a moment when the Shah was kind of semi-deposed, but because Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected, he was a left Democrat, secular Democrat, and when he tried to nationalize the oil industry, yeah, I think it was Kermit Roosevelt and Christopher Woodhouse of MI6 and the CIA, they organized a kind of coup. I think they used the religious right to help them overthrow Mossadegh. But after they basically conducted the coup, and then because I think Britain was trying to I think it was the British secretary was trying to convince John Foster Dulles to help Britain gain the profits from the oil industry. And after that was done, it was basically just Britain embargoed Iran, and then after that, the entire like what was it, Operation Ajax and Operation Boot happened, and I think the CIA actually helped invent the SAVAK and everything. And from then on, they were just the full-on pro-British, pro-American Shah regime, and they were just a brutal repression from then on. And not many people realize that I think it was almost every layer of Iranian society took to the streets to overthrow the Shah, and then it was co-opted.
Yes, 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 absolutely. I think like ever like for the good half of the first half of the 20th century, there's always been this sort of the fight against the left. So in our countries, in our region, that has always been the fight from by the West, has always been done through like also the empowering of religious movements in order to sort of replace that, replace the left, the power of the left with with more right-wing religious movements that happened in Afghanistan, that happened in Iran, and all over the region. So that was definitely something that they had. It was is designed it, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And of course, then the nationalization of oil, which was just something that they would not accept. And it turned everything, it like this dream of a democratic Iran, independent Iran, sovereign Iran, was hijacked in that moment. And everything that happened afterwards always happened under the shadow of that year, of that coup, for sure.
And after the revolution in 79 occurred, after it was co-opted, I guess you could call it a counter-revolution. It was kind of co-opted by the Khomeiniite faction. I think he only uh, said he was going to be a transitional leader, and
Yeah.
then he consolidated power after Saddam started his invasion. For people who don't know the brief, I guess, like period during the Iran-Iraq War, inside Iran, what was happening? What kind of consolidation of power was happening?
So yes, the war started. Saddam invaded Iran a year after the revolution, and this war lasted for 8 years. Saddam took over some southern part of Iran, but then like during that first or second year, Iran was able to take that back, but then they just kept fighting. Both sides just kept fighting and dragged it on for these 8 year war, which was devastating for Iranians because, I mean, first of all, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, disappeared, injured. And also, inside the country, the regime was able to very much remove all opposition to it because during the first years, for example, when my parents were arrested, it was 1983. So there were some years which were they're still active, even though they had gone underground because it didn't feel safe anymore. But they were still, they were still sort of, you could see the dictatorship taking, hold. But by 1983 was the last wave of arrests of all opposition parties at this point, everybody. And then in 1988, they kept them in prisons until 1988. But then that last year of Iran-Iraq war, they decided to just get rid of everybody who's still inside prisons, which led to the mass executions of 1988. So those 8 years in Iran was a time when the regime, the hardcore part of the regime, the sort of the voices that were saying, well, actually this was not what we who were opposing Khomeini's taking over. They were all sidelined, some put under house arrest, some imprisoned, and so on. So it was a moment that this war was used. It was the perfect excuse while they were sending these like 12-year-old, 13-year-old to fight along with adults. Inside the country was the perfect time to consolidate power through absolute oppression and violence. And then by 1988, it was like completely established under Khomeini's rule and all the people who were aligned with him.
And just for those who don't know, I think it was after Saddam invaded in 80, there was a period in 81 and 82 where there was a series of mass executions where I think it's what the regime likes to call a kind of cultural revolution, but it was basically a kind of Islamist purge where they basically co arrested basically every communist, socialist, social democrat, feminist, atheist, democrat of basically every kind, and conducted a kind of mass series of arbitrary detentions, summary executions. I think the former UN like special rapporteur, Javed Rahman, for in 2024 called that era of 2020 of no of 1981 and 1982 a series of mass, basically crimes against humanity. I think he called it genocide as well in his reports. In this era of, I guess, this kind of reign of terror, how much did the civil society change? Because I think the regime has done a very good job of kind of retconning this entire like series of mass executions in 82, even in 88. So people completely have no idea. It's the kind of black spot in their memory. Just explain that for a second.
I think what there were, I think, many factors to these two rounds of executions, mass executions and massacres that happened in early 80s and then 80, which was for one thing, I think people, because of the memory of the coup, I think they were worried that their revolution, what they had fought for was once again going to be, sort of stolen by the West. And they were very much afraid of the coup. So I think there was this feeling of we need to protect the revolution. And I think those who knew about the executions and imprisonment, probably a lot of them sort of excused it in their minds and justified it because like they probably thought, I mean, I've heard these and read these, they thought that the only thing that mattered was protecting the revolution. And that was one factor. And then, of course, there was the war. A lot of people were displaced, were out of their homes. It was very, very difficult time financially. And so that was another thing that people were, was on people's minds. And I think because they hadn't seen, I mean, now we look at executions and we know the precedent of it. And I think at the time they didn't really know, maybe some of them didn't really believe. Also because, for example, in 88, that which I know more about, like families were forbidden to mourn. We were forbidden to even put up a picture or even say the name of the person who has been executed. So even families had to live this in silence. So they weren't even able to talk to each other about. It was something we had to hide. And that, of course, encouraged this silence, which then, makes it easy for the oppression to continue. So I think there were all these factors happening. It was a very, I think, a frightened of a society and confused and shocked. I think people at the time, especially in the early 80s, didn't really know what was happening. Right now we have so much access to information and still people don't know what's true and what's not. Just imagine at the time. So I think there were just so many factors that made it easy and easier for the regime to carry out these massacres because they basically had no opposition, the very little opposition to it.
And the main I guess spikes and executions was the beginning and the end of the Iran-Iraq War, and it seems to be a pattern where whenever there's a kind of I guess external event, the regime uses a kind of pretext of national security to quote unquote get rid of foreign external or internal enemies or whatever, and then that becomes an excuse for mass execution. I think in '88, Khomeini basically put out a kind of fatwa where like everyone who was either considered a munafiq or a kafir or muharib or whatever would just be executed. And I think even the president, what was his name? Ibrahim Raisi, he was one of the main uh, uh,
One of the
hanging judges
judges. Mhm.
in the death commission. I think it was when they
Yeah.
ca I think the number that the UN Human Rights Council came up with about was about 30,000. They executed in '88.
Yes, I mean that's another time where the numbers were never verified because a lot of people were buried in mass graves. So the number could go anything from 3,000 to 30,000 because there were also lots of mujahideens were executed. So it's just like the massacre of this January, where it is being done in secret, it is being done in silence, where any kind of sort of reporting on it is completely banned. Those numbers are never verified, but yes, it was a big number, and it all happened in that summer. And for families who had lost someone, they would find out 3, 4 months later because like many prisons, like there were no, like they were closed off to families. Families couldn't visit. All the visits were canceled. So people would find out that someone had been killed, their father, their uncle had been killed, their son, months later without even having a body to bury. So this has also been another method. This denial, this when you have no body to bury, you have nothing. It's as if, it has never happened. So for example, for women who lost their husbands, they didn't even have a death certificate. To say if they wanted to marry again, for example, they didn't have a death certificate of their husbands because it was as if the husband never existed. So these are all these methods of sort of carrying on this silence, prolonging this silence.
And post '88, after all the mass executions, there was a kind of relative, I guess, calm until like the 1990s with the student uprisings. For those who don't know about the student uprisings all the way till the Green Movement, just explain that era because that was the whole post '89 revolution, the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, with a completely different, I guess, ethos. But whatever was happening in Iran was kind of, I guess, not noticed. Just explain that.
Yes, I think that was the first time, yes, in the 90s with the student movements, which was over the closure of a reformist newspaper. And students took to the streets, and there was a very violent crackdown. They entered students' dorms, started beating them, taking them to prisons and so on. Um, which was also the time that the first reformist voices were being heard. The president at the time, Khatami was elected. So there was this sort of, I think that was probably, at least for me personally too, it was the first time this we realized that there wasn't only the hardcore of the regime. There was also something else happening. There were all the people who were trying to reform some of it, to open up a little bit, to open up. They were at the same time that there was that crackdown. There were like every day there would be a new newspaper coming out. They would shut it down again. Two more would come out. So that was the first sort of after that horror of the 80s. That was the first time something was opening in Iran. But at the same time, that was also when this crackdown on any sort of change. So not only that they had removed all opposition, but anyone asking even for the smallest reform, for believing the regime, but just thinking, okay, maybe we need to open up. And that was also constantly being repressed, even though people were fighting. So I think that fight that the Iranian people have had with the regime really started then. They had come out of this massacre. Their children were now in their early 20s. That's an important thing. This was this new generation, my generation, who was now sort of trying to make an influence, make an impact on politically on where this regime is going and where the country is going. Um, which then, led to the 2009 Green Movement and, coming forward to today.
In terms of the 2009 Green Movement, it was a
Yeah.
kind, if I'm understanding correctly, it was a kind of reformist movement, like I guess moderately religious, democratic movement. How seriously should we take the whole, like I guess, attempt to reform the regime in that era, the whole like Rafsanjani, Khatami, Mohammed Ahmadinejad, like is that like is something that really means much in the long arc of history, or is it just a kind of minor trend that was a function of the era of like globalized capitalism and everything in between?
No, I think it was very important. It was important because I think people were really trying to find a way to change things for the better, to move Iran toward a democratic path and future without everybody needing to pay a very high price, without people needing to be killed again, people being present again. I think it was this idea that slow but certain change, just slow steps forward. Um, and so when we got to 2009, which was after 4 years of Ahmadinejad, which things had changed so much for the worse in Iran, politically, economically, on as far as geopolitics is concerned. And I think it was like sort of like, and people still believe that if they vote, I think people still very much believed in the ballot, which I think is a very important um, sort of understanding for a society to start to want to believe in institutions and make the institutions work for you, not believe in them as they are, but trying to find your ways of influencing them to make them work for you. So I think it was important because that was really when also just drew that line. Like you're not going to cross this line. Yes, I might let you vote sometimes, but if I feel like any of my interest is endangered, even if it's reform, I won't let you take one. As we see, the leaders of the Green Movement are still under house arrest. Um, so I think it was important because it was in our region, I think it was a fundamental path toward democracy, just really, really believed in, carried forward by the people themselves.
So I guess it was like a kind of necessary phase, even if it was naive, I guess.
I think it's I don't know if the word naive is the right word because everything could even either be, if we think of everything as naive, then we might sometimes not try things. So I think it was important for people to do that. And I think probably some parts of Iran, I mean, we saw the massacre that happened in January. So what is again, what do we want to do? We don't want people to get killed like that. So I think it's just sort of reaching democracy is a very complex, long, painful labor. and it has so many different um, components to it, you know. And I think this was one of them. And I do think that even though we don't see the effects now, but all of these things eventually do contribute to whatever future people are trying to make.
And how much do you analyze the value of the Green Movement as it led to the 2017, 2018, 2019 process? I think it was against the mandatory hijab at that point.
Yeah. The hijab was in 2022. I think 2017, 2018, they were like strikes. They were all like sort of continuing the same thing. You know, they went back again and voted for Rouhani this time. And they hoped in a deal with the United States so that the sanctions could be lifted. So there were like so many different things happening, you know, and people were just like, I think whatever was happening in those years, people had different priorities politically, you know, and economically. So they would like do something because at that moment that was the priority. Like for example, at the time, you know, when there was a nuclear deal, that was for the people the priority because like economically they were suffering. Um, so I think it's always that people every time they are repressed, every time they come out more numerous, more adamant, but also more radical. You know, 2009, nobody was saying down with the regime, death to Khamenei, and all of that. But we heard that. We just kept hearing it more and more and more. And at the same time, we also heard them chanting pro-monarchist chants, which was something that nobody ever imagined. That had also happened, you know. And I think part of that was because, like, when you just keep being pushed back, humiliated, repressed, you just sort of like the level of desperation also keeps going up, you know, because you feel like whatever you do, it's not responding. You don't know what else to do. So you try to find alternatives. So I think even that, even people chanting for, you know, pro-monarchist regimes was also, other than all the propaganda by, you know, the TVs, the monarchist TVs and so on, but it was also because the Islamic regime had oppressed and removed all opposition inside the country. All the activists are in prisons, you know, there's silence. So when you do that, it's like the Islamic Republic did that, and this was the result. People were just clinging onto something from the outside.
And that then eventually led to 2022 when Gina Masa Amini was killed by the regime for improper veiling. And that was
Yeah.
the beginning of the Women Life Freedom movement. I think it started in Kurdistan because it
Hmm.
was linked from the Rojava Revolution, the Women Life Freedom Revolution. I guess it was secular feminists, anarchist socialists in Syrian Kurdistan. And it started in Iranian Kurdistan, but then it spread to all of Iran. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, the main, I guess, unique achievement of women like freedom was that unlike previous uprisings, it unified like every single like class in Iran. It unified men and women. It also unified every single ethnicity. So just talk about that for a second.
Yeah. I continue to believe that women life freedom was probably one of the most progressive movements in our not only in Iran but in our region because it was yes it was sparked by the mandatory hijab, but it was definitely a real cry of rebellion against patriarchy and against theocracy and against this sort of patriarchal oppression of all minorities, you know, because what was just incredible and beautiful about this movement was that it was led by women, by minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and by young people. They were out and I think it was one of those times that people were fighting for something. They weren't only fighting against something. You know, it wasn't so much about Islamic Republic or not Islamic Republic. It was about fundamental change. Like this military, patriarchal military state has to change. And it has to change for the people. It has to change for people's dignity. It has to change for people's freedom, equality. So I think it was one of those things that we still see the effect of it. It was more than an uprising, more than a revolt. It was truly a movement, which also, sorry, we have the have the police siren. I don't know if you can hear it. Um, I think what was also fundamental about it, being a feminist movement, it was just connected to such long history of a feminist movement in Iran, of anti-patriarchy movement in Iran, which led to this moment. It wasn't just spontaneous, even though the people coming to the street was, but it had a lot to do with the fight that women had put up throughout these decades. So I think it was one of those things that Iran changed, even though Islamic Republic stayed, but Iran changed. And the society changed too, because we also have to remember that the Islamic Republic also exists because like parts of Iranian society is patriarchal, is conservative, is religious. It upholds those ideals that the Islamic Republic is based upon. And I think this also changed that as society has changed so much, has seen so much, has opened up so much, and grown so much. So I think it's like no matter what happens in Iran, I think that change will always be there. And whatever we decide, we people try to build, will always be built on what that movement achieved.
And in terms of the, I guess, kind of origins of it, I was thinking about it the other day, and if I'm not mistaken, the Women Life Freedom Revolution, it's a secularist, like democratic, feminist revolution, but it's also intersectional, which is something that people often forget. Like I remember in the early days of 2022 when it happened, and people were reacting to it, like there were random people on Instagram, and rather than declaring solidarity with the movement some people, not like the intelligentsia, but like I guess random people, like moderate believers, were more concerned with whether or not this makes like religion look bad. Like, oh, there's no such thing as a morality police in the Quran. Like, people were trying to do this kind of like I guess like separation, and there's a kind of confused priorities. So in terms of like the ideology of the movement, just explain that for a second, because if I'm not mistaken, even after 2023 with the genocide in Gaza, the movement in Iran declared solidarity with the Palestine National Liberation Movement as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, lots of Iranian activists, women's rights activists, human rights activists have always been in absolute solidarity with the Palestinian movements and the Palestinian cause. And I think yes, I think there was this conversation when they tried to I think some of even progressive spaces would give this sense as if, like whatever people however people are fighting against the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic in some ways in those spaces is considered as like the only, power fighting against imperialism. They, I think, seem to forget what that fight is supposed to be about. So if they are in rhetoric and in theory fighting against imperialism, but manifesting the same, exploitation and oppression and repression of the people on the ground. So then what is the difference? And I think in that case they were sort of trying to discredit the Women Life Freedom movement as something that is like maybe anti-religion or Islamophobic, which wasn't. It was something, first of all, because it was not even anti-hijab, it was anti-mandatory hijab. If you want to talk about something simple, like the simple symbol of that movement. So I think the conversations are sometimes I think like led to wrong, I don't know, like distracted, led to different path that's not what the thing is about. I think in Iran, there are people, religious people in Iran. There are people who, I mean, there's everything in Iran, just like any country. But I think when people talk about a secular state, it just means that for the religion and state to be two separate things, for religion not to be politicized, not to have a say in laws that concern people's daily life. And I think that's what people have always been fighting. That's what people have problem with theocracy, with a theocratic state, not with the religion of that state. And if they do, that is wrong. They should not have a problem because it doesn't matter what religion it is. We've seen throughout history, Iranian regime is not, it's not unique. So I think, unfortunately, this happens and is happening again, that we are ready to sacrifice a people and their very legitimate grievances and demands for a democratic, equal society, free society, in that sort of geopolitical talk about who's against who, you know, which then would only sacrifice the people of the region, not only Iranians, Palestinians more than anybody. So I really think it's time. If not now, I really don't know when we can talk about these things. That we should not be afraid of telling the truth about what makes people suffer, but all parts of it, what the regime does, what the empire does, what imperialism does to our region, all of that, but at the same time also keeping our own regimes accountable for what they do. Um, yeah.
In terms of why this kind of reaction happens, why do you think it happens? Because I have a theory, but I want to know what you.
I mean, to me, from what I understand, it happens because the world has become polarized. And I think whatever sort of agenda people have become more important than people's lives. And geopolitics has become important than people's lived experience. And I think they only do that as if they want they of course I understand that at a time when Israel has carried out 3 ongoing years of genocide and no one has lifted a finger, the entire world has watched. They and it carries on it in Palestine, in Lebanon. They take ships off international water. I mean, it's as if like no rules, no laws exist for them. They're above law. And that has to be, I think, condemned and fought against, not not by but by a regime that if whenever it has a chance it kills its own people, and it's taking the region to so a bigger war is not the answer to that genocide. But I'd love to hear your theory too.
I mean, for what I think, I guess the reason why some people are hesitant to criticize the regime or the ideology of the regime, because if I'm not mistaken, it's Khomeini said the main philosophy behind the Islamic Republic was the velayat-i faqih, the guardianship of the jurist or the cleric, like invented to say that like orphans, mad people, lost people were to be kind of wards of the state, and this kind of like big brother totalitarian logic was applied to the entire country. From my perspective, I try to think of it as like if people are hesitant to criticize the regime, or I guess criticize theocracy, they're worried that if they go too far in their criticism, they're basically making like an atheist critique, which they either don't want to do or refuse to do, which therefore leads to a kind of backtracking where it can't be the regime. The regime is the vanguard of anti-imperialism in the region. The regime is the only counterweight to Israeli colonialism. It can't be the case that the regime is what people say it is. It's like a dividing by zero error where people can't or like refuse to accept it, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean for sure that's part of it too, because I think in our region we have never really talked about the what about religion, our relationship to it, our private relationship to it, our political relationship to it, and how do we cherish people who are religious, cherish the religion, practice the religion without it being used as a tool to oppress. We still have not had that conversation. And it's not only in Iran, right? It's like all over the region, there's this problem. And I think it's a fundamental problem. And we should not be scared of talking about it because we see the results of it now. Um, and I think it's also To be honest, I think it's also a colonialist gaze to look at our region and think that things are constantly only done to us, as if we have no agency, as if we just sort of sit around and wait either to be saved or to be oppressed. Like we have no say in this. And this is not how it is. People are fighting, have been fighting throughout the region. We had the Arab Spring. Some dictatorships are secular, some of them are religious, some of them are right, some of them are, maybe some leftover of a leftist ideology of a revolution. So it's sort of like we're all in that same space where we are trapped, between, of course, the imperialist agenda that only has its own interest in mind, and it's by now everyone knows that there's just nothing is, all the masks have fallen, and then these dictators that are using that and in order to just like stay in power and shed as much as blood as possible. So I think these are fundamental questions, and religion for sure is one of them. And how much are we as a society, as a region, willing to accept politicized religion and willing to accept that through it, a lot of our minorities will be oppressed. And that's the conversation we still haven't had, I fear.
To my mind, when I think about it, I feel like it seems like a difficult conversation, but it shouldn't have to be. Like, for example, basically the Iranian people have spent 4 decades under theocracy, and therefore they have a dim view of religion. Like that's not like an unreasonable position to have. And more than that, to say that the Iranian people haven't tried to resist in many ways is simply not true because the Iranian people, I mean, from even from your generation and your generation onwards, I mean, your generation basically grew up with the mullahs. Even the Shah's regime is like a fairy tale. And in your generation, you marched arm in arm in pagan festivals, you taunted the clerics, you burned the hijab, or I guess that's going to be Gen Z, but and they did everything they could to criticize the regime and the ideology, the religious ideology behind it, without necessarily, I guess, being sectarian to other believers. Like, for example, for the Women Life Freedom movement, if I remember correctly, there were even like Sunni and Shia clerics here and there who came out in some small number in favor of the revolution as well. So it's not like a kind of, it doesn't have to
Oh,
be like only atheists who are saying this.
yes, absolutely. I mean, there are so many religious figures in Iran who, even since the revolution itself, didn't believe that there should be a supreme leader and that there should be a religious. It was like, no, we have another responsibility, our responsibility with spirituality, with guidance, moral guidance, and so on. We have our centers, we have where, we can gather and do that very important work. Politics is not our, but it's like all over, like also in Europe, like I lived in Italy for a long time, and that was one of the first time I saw that, there is that clash, there is that conflict. Some parts of a more conservative religious groups who want to be in power, who want to have a say whenever, for example, when it's about like gay marriage and things that religion does not some religious views don't want to accept. And then there's also the other ones that are, sorry, that's loud. I have and all these other religious groups that don't accept that. So this is like the entire world has been, dealing with this for centuries, you know. And so it's also like we shouldn't like in our region pretend like this we just like sort of happen to have this conversation. This is something that people have been dealing with for a long time. How to make these boundaries, how to make it work for the people, how to make it inclusive, right? Um, so yeah, absolutely. In Iran too. And to be honest, I think that I mean in a democratic society, if someone feels like against religion, they should be able to have to say that without risking their lives. They have had their own journey. Of course, being anti-religion is not inclusive. So that's a conversation to have to say, okay, this is not, it's one thing not to want to have religion in your life, and it's another thing to be against it. But but all of this does not happen when people risk. execution for just speaking up, you know.
And that kind of brings us to the most recent moments where in late December and early January of this year, there was a kind of, I guess, second phase of the Women Life Freedom Revolution where there was a mass uprising. And basically, I think it was like every layer, like every section of Iran, even including Ali Khamenei's, I think it was the town he was born in Mashhad. Every layer of Iran rose up in a second revolution, well, no, I mean, as in uprising, and as that was happening, the regime started a mass um, uh, crackdown where they basically, according to like some numbers from like human rights organizations, like Iranian human rights organizations based in the US and in Norway, like Hengo and Harana and other places, the figures are at minimum like 5,000 to tens of like 30,000 innocent people massacred in the uprising. One of the disturbing things I noticed was from certain sections of the, I guess you could say, the campist faction of the like international of the anti-imperialist, anti-war socialist left was the first reaction was atrocity denial. Like I remember seeing like Mohammed Marandi, a very well-known regime propagandist. He's the professor of English literature at Tehran University. He's famous on or infamous on Piers Morgan on British TV. I saw lots of sections of independent left-wing media like Brianna Joy Gray, Katie Halper, uh, Rania Khalek at Breakthrough News, Rachel Blevins, Jimmy Dore, and even in the UK, like he was invited on to Electronic Intifada into Mint Press News, and the main like narrative he was spreading was the revolutionaries were not revolutionaries; they were just rioters who I don't know what hated either the regime or the people. They just supposedly murdered police officers, and that was it. And then Mohammed Randi, like he couldn't even keep the narrative straight. At one point he said they were foreign-backed insurgents and they were Mossad. Then another point he said they were all just far-right monarchist Pahlavi supporters. And how do you make sense of this kind of weird campist, I don't know what to call it, mindset that the first instinct is not even say like a, a kind of hesitancy to be truly intersectional in their anti-imperialism, but in some cases just outright supporting full-on regime propagandists. Like the other day, I saw Mohammed Randi go on to Kyle Kalinski's secular talk of all places. Like literally, Kyle Kalinski. I didn't think he would be on. He would invite regime propagandists or whatever. I mean, this
Yeah.
kind of mentality is so like common. What do you make of it?
It's for me, it's like one of the most heartbreaking things. Like every time I think about it, every time I hear it, every time I see it, it's just like I think the first thing I feel is really just grief that we have come to a point where human life and the loss of it is so easily dismissed. And as you said, without hesitation, I think that part is just what hurts most. Just like, it's just like, no, it's denied, it's rejected. And because each side is trying to empower its own narrative on the imperialists like Trump administration and Israel they use those numbers in order to you know make it a little bit easier to even though they were going to attack anyway, everyone knows that. And on the other side, the more, these spaces that you were talking about, they are just denying it because they want the Islamic Republic to look like heroes standing up to empire, to Israel, and so on. And in none of this conversation, the people's lives is even a matter of conversation. What hurts most, though, is that by doing this, by exactly inviting like leftist progressive spaces, by inviting people like Marandi and all these Islamic Republic propagandists, what they do is just letting extreme right hijack a very important, a legitimate people's movement, as they have done before. That's the only thing they're doing. They are letting the extreme right come and say, and they're letting people in Iran, for example, they are going to lose all their faith, all their trust, because if they look at leftist, leftist figures, saying, no, that never happened, when they know that it happened because it happened to them, because they saw the corpses, they saw the blood. So they say, and then they hear, for example, someone like Trump or, like all these extreme right just say, just come and say, yes, we did it, and then we're going to go save them. So who do you think they're going to listen to? Definitely not the person who's going to deny them, deny their truth. And I think this is going to hurt the left so much if it hasn't already. It's going to make people lose their trust and faith in them if it hasn't already. And I really don't know how we can fix this situation because I feel like it's already too late. And people like me who go around and try to say, our fight against Israel's genocide and for the Palestinian cause and against America's sort of imperialist adventures in the region is as intense as and as strong as our fight against the Islamic Republic. Um, no one's listening, because no one wants to think about these two things, which I think is like the most simplest way of looking at it. You just say they're both doing the same thing, so let's just like condemn both and find another way, find something that works for the people. And they're just, these unfortunately these leftist spaces, and I'm a leftist, and that's why it hurts so much. Um, they are just sort of like undermining their own legitimacy. That's what they're doing, and they politically they're gonna pay for it later when people don't believe them and don't trust them anymore.
One of the most like disappointing parts about it for me was these are people who should know better. Like, I mean, if the UN rapporteur for the human rights in Iran, Mai Saito, comes out and says, and by my estimate, at least 5,000 people have been killed. You see the videos from Karazakh Forensic Medical Center. Even the UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning it. When Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the International Federation of Human Rights, the International Commission of Jurists, when everyone can come out and provide human rights reports that condemn this, and you see, I don't know who, Sagar Enjeti and Kristen Ball on Breaking Points say stuff like, one of these human rights organizations are based in Maryland and Fairfax, like Harana. Therefore, that axiomatically somehow discredits what they're saying as if empirical data isn't empirical or something.
Yes, it's just like really insane to me. And it's just so violent in its own way, and also because like how many thousands have to be killed for them to think that this is wrong? And why is one killing wrong and the other killing not right? And why is it only about who's oppressing but not the oppression itself? This has to end because if we just keep going around only looking at who's doing it, but not what's being done, nothing will ever change because it's a vicious circle and it just keeps going around and around forever.
And it also misses a crucial point, which is that the women life freedom movement is an intersectional one. I mean, they
Yeah.
declared solidarity with Palestine. I'm pretty sure it's anti-Zionist as well. And even people in Iran, like the trade union workers, many people have already said that they oppose to what Israel's doing. And when I hear people talk about this in this way, the authentic Persian identity is one of Shia Islam from Imam Hussein and the Battle of Karbala or whatever. I feel like it's almost detached from reality because it doesn't reflect the lived experience of everybody in Iran, the people on the ground who've lived under the theocracy, have had to organize against it, have to live with the forced disappearances, the executions, the unmarked mass graves. It's almost as if they're in another planet or something. They're not recognizing the evidence. So I don't know what to
Yes,
make of it.
yes, yes. And also because like they're all pretending like people just sort of took to the street in January, like it never happened before. As if like we basically have had like an uprising in Iran every 2, 3 years. I don't know with what other language people are supposed to know to say they don't want the regime. They want the regime gone. Now, of course, that's a whole conversation, how the regime's going away, how to turn the dictatorship into democracy, and all of that important conversation. But in any case, I think but also by them saying, oh, they're rioters or they're Mossad agents or everybody knows Mossad was on the ground. Sometimes they change that into Mossad was killing the protesters. Sometimes they change that into they were among the protesters killing. Like, so we don't even know. And these are all the different narratives that the regime has put out. No one ever saying, but does a regime have the right to kill its people for taking to the streets? If it happened in your city and your country, what would you say? Would you say, oh, well, they were like rioters and they were like, disturbing the peace? Aren't we all fighting against that? Isn't that what the left is about? So when did the left become just sort of this sort of, I don't know, like the only thing that seems to matter is to have the rhetoric of anti-Western imperialism, which is an important position to have. It's valid. It's an important fight. It's been going on for a long time. But to turn that into something that's only on the surface and not look at how that has, what the people's like if you're not even worried about the people anymore, basically. So that to me is not even left anymore. I don't know what it is, to be honest.
To be fair, there have been some people on the left, like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur
Yeah.
for the occupied Palestinian territories, Yanis Varoufakis, Gabor
Yes.
Mate, and other people
Yes.
here and there who have since
Yeah.
not as recently, but I know for Yanis Varoufakis, he declared solidarity with the Women Life Freedom movement back in 2022, and I was glad to see it.
Yeah.
How do you view how things are going to go in the future? Because from what I can tell, these sorts of campus figures are getting very popular very quickly, and it seems to be almost impossible to argue against. I mean, it's not even just like naive or confused people who have taken in a little bit of regime propaganda, because, for example, there are some people who are just outright fifth columns, like Max Blumenthal, George Galloway, and people who are basically like Mohammed Randi. And these sorts of figures are becoming like lionized or revered in certain factions of the left. How does this argument how do we counter them? Because I mean, if they just say that all the protesters were Mossad or Pahlavi supporters, that doesn't change anything for the people on the ground, and the situation will just carry on, and the lived experience will just be denied.
Yeah. And also like, being a Pahlavi supporter doesn't mean you're supposed to get killed or executed. Um, But I think there's also, of course, I think it's also very important to mention that this is after 3 years of genocide. So we are all angry. We are all feeling helpless and desperate and broken. And we see no end to it. And I think this is also that reaction to it. So this is also something that we need to take into account. Um, the only way I think that we can actually address this conversation is first that these wars have to end. Israel's occupation of Palestine has to end. Israel's bombing of Lebanon has to end. And until those things don't end, until the threat of more bombing just is, hanging over Iran, we cannot have these conversations because these are huge threats and they're destroying lives. I I keep in my own space and work try to keep talking about both of them all the time because I think people will eventually listen. But if these wars keep going, these sort of polarization will become even more and more violent. Because people can't think, they're too emotional. Some of them have agendas and some of them are just too emotional, too broken. So I think that's number one. And number two is really if the masks have fallen as they have fallen, the only thing we have is the truth. And I said that before. The only thing, we should not run away from the truth. We should not try to make one look prettier than it is. For example, the Islamic Republic. We have to always, it's the only weapon we have. Hiding things, denying things, manipulating narratives. I don't think it's going to work. It could work for the next couple of weeks and months, but not in a long term. So the only way is for all of us to go back to the truth of our governments, the truth of our regions, and just talk about them. honestly and truthfully and courageously and try to come up with something that is for all of our region, you know, that is for Afghanistan as much as it is for Iran, because Iran can never be this free, prosperous country if we have what's happening in Afghanistan to Afghan people. So I think we have to think of a bigger picture at this point.
In terms of the situation on the ground, if I understand the Women Life Freedom movement properly, there's all sorts of involvement from different ethnic groups like the Kurds and the Balochis. How much do we hear from these areas in general? For those who don't know, the Kurdish people, ever since the end of the First World War, have been subjected to I think it was during Sykes-Picot, there was a kind of quadruple partition of Kurdistan's area from southern Turkey, eastern Syria, northern Iraq, and western Iran. Since the movement started there, what have we heard from Kurdistan? And also, Balochistan was like a triple partition. What have we heard from these areas?
I mean, to be honest, very little. First of all, because of the internet shutdown, it's really hard to have any, like for people to make statements and to speak. And I think in these times of war, it has created this space of course, fear and oppression, and people are not sure what's going to happen next. So I haven't heard anything. I During the protest, the Kurdish, I think some of the Kurdish organizations, they uh, they declared their solidarity with the movement, and they declared their position against Pahlavi and the monarchists. Some of them did, but overall, I at the moment I don't know what their positions are.
And in terms of, I guess, giving, I guess, the devil its due, one of the more, I guess, honorable reasons why a lot of people on the left are engaging this kind of campus mentality is because they're worried about the Iranian diaspora being astroturfed by certain factions of either Mossad or so on. And because during January, we saw the movement talking about, having slogans like Death to Khomeini. All of a sudden, on the internet and here and there, you started randomly seeing a kind of vast uptick in like bring back the Shah, we want the Shah, and we started seeing slogans like one nation, one leader, one flag, which is just like a fascist Nazi slogan. What do we make of the increase in Pahlavi supporters in terms of how vocal they are in terms of the diaspora? Is that like potential astroturfing? Is that something that's a reasonable concern to be worried about? And what does that look like in the future? Because from what I can tell, the Pahlavi supporters seem to be like ardent Zionists as well. So how does that look like going forward?
Yeah. Um, it's been really hard to tell how um powerful they are and how present is of if they're only just really loud and they have platforms that they can use, or they're really that numerous. It's really, really been hard to tell. And another reason is because of the digital shutdown and the crackdown of the Iranian regime. So it's really hard to understand. But it is true that it's there and it's present both in the diaspora and inside Iran. And as I mentioned before, part of it is because of this, crackdown of any sort of opposition inside the countries, that civil society that has been fighting the regime, and they're all in prison. So in that void, I think the Pahlavi, supporters have taken more space. And there's also all the propaganda, all the support they're getting from Western countries. Um, and yes, they are absolutely they're Zionist. Some of them are I think some of them are sympathizers, some of them are extreme right. I mean, it's probably a mix there too. And I think yes, they have to be taken in, into account. Their presence is important. Um, I feel that it has hurt the democratic movements inside Iran. It has um, put this shadow over them, because now outside of Iran, anybody who thinks about civil resistance in Iran thinks they're somehow connected to the Pahlavi movement, which is not true at all. So I think it has also hurt the narrative a lot. That narrative of resistance and the fight in Iran on the ground, fighting the good fight on the ground. It has hurt it and discredited so much, which is like one of my biggest worries. Um, but now after the war, things seem to have changed a little bit because, it was obvious that what they were saying, wanted and thought this war is going to work out was not true in any shape and form. Um, so now I guess, it's one of those things that now what we can do is try to amplify voices inside Iran, activists inside Iran. But again, it's a limbo and we're all just waiting to see what's going to happen next.
And one of the worst things is that people conveniently forget when we talk about, even if we were going to take just war theory and all this stuff seriously, it would require a competent government or competent military to actually do it. And with the Trump administration, we've literally seen the most like ignorance, arrogance, openly corrupt administration in like modern American history. I mean, Trump and Hegseth make Bush and Rumsfeld look like tactical geniuses in comparison, and Israel
Yeah.
is just a genocidal government and a genocidal society. So in terms of now that the ceasefire has happened, how much damage has this kind of random destructive intervention done to the civil society in Iran? Because when you have these kinds of interventions, unfortunately, what it seems to do is it seems to turn the civil society, the pro-democracy movement, into like bystanders or spectators, and it removes them of agency and also gives the regime a pretext, like a national security pretext, to carry out the very executions that they are carrying out now. So, how much damage has this kind of intervention done to the future of the pro-democracy movement in Iran?
Oh, it has done just terrible damage. Um, First, because it has hardened that sort of brutal core of the regime. Because, of course, the regime has also so many different sides. It has created this space where now talking against the regime equals, be cooperating with enemy, cooperating with Israel, cooperating with the US. And also just physical spaces, when people feel threatened to come out, even physically to be together. I think that also creates these limits, to communication and the digital shutdown. So I think, and also because like, inflation is skyrocketing, everything is just so expensive, people are poorer. And so even activists are having a hard time to even like, in their daily lives. And so I think it has done just terrible damage. I only believe in the resilience of our civil society and hope that they will come out of this. But it has, I think, set them back so much. Um, and definitely made it much harder for them, much harder for them to fight, much harder for them to speak. Um, so yeah, no, I mean it's horrible.
Well, I mean, I don't know how it's going to get better over time, but hopefully,
Yeah.
I guess we'll see what happens. Thank you so much for talking to me, Sahar. I know you're very busy.
No,
Hope people buy your book. It's still on my reading list. I haven't got around to it yet, but your new book is coming out in 2027. I think it's For Every Person You Kill by Melville
yes,
House.
yes.
And we'll see what happens. So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Sahar.
Thank you.